here's my introduction into how to do Fire Kasina, and towards the end there's a specific focus on color control. Note that this audio is for most part recorded in a live session, so if there are any disfluences. Another reason is that I'm editing this recording a few months later, and as I'm doing it, I'm adding more comments. So you will probably hear the differences in my voice because I'm recording in different condition. And so I'm making this Frankenstein recording. I apologize for that, and I thank you for listening despite my technical limitations. And here it goes. When it comes to the tool to use for Fire Kasina, the most typical source of light is the fire, so typically a candle. But you can also use an LED flashlight from your phone or a light bulb or any other source of light. In the following part of the clip from the session, I explain why using a fire might be better than using another source of artificial light. Although you can use any light that you find suitable to produce good results with this practice. So the distinction between the candle and the flashlight, I would recommend generally to use a candle, not for some romantic purposes, but because I find that it builds stronger concentration, because you also need to actually focus while you're developing the nimitta. So if the trick here is that candle fire is less brighter than artificial light, so you need to look at it longer before you close your eyes. So that part of the practice is also an important concentration meditation. So if you're very confident with being able to assess subjectively how strong your focus is, and that you're able to stick with the object firmly, then I guess it doesn't make much of a difference. However, for me, from practice, the candle works much better. And in terms of the types of candles, I would recommend a larger candle that has a bigger flame, because the flame is less reactive and it moves less stable as possible. I mean, they will move with the air occasionally, and that's fine, but you don't want a candle that moves too much. And you'd also want a flame that has enough brightness so that you don't have to stare at it too long. Another reason why a candle might develop stronger concentration, and this is again something that comes from my experience and something that I would argue, is the flicker of the flame itself. So when you stare at the candle that flickers, your eyes are constantly adjusting to that. So your eyes very quickly start to synchronize with that flicker, and I believe that somehow affects how your brain works, which can have a significant impact considering that the visual cortex takes up the biggest part of your brain. So I think the candle is good to repeat because you need to look into the flame longer, and there you also build concentration. And the other reason might be the flicker of the flame. So to make it simple, what you probably want to get is a simple white paraffin candle, one of those long ones that has about 2-3 centimeter high flame. Maybe you'll want to avoid tea lights, although ultimately you can use any source of light. What I'm describing here are what in my view are the optimal conditions. I feel like I also need to add a short warning
that if you're using light bulbs or LEDs or those kinds of artificial lights, just please be mindful that they can be quite strong, that they can be stronger than what your eye can handle, and that you might risk eye damage. And please do not use the sun to start your nimitta, because that is dangerous. The sun might burn your retina very quickly, as it has happened to me.
Another thing is that it's good to position a candle in a way that the flame doesn't have the white part of the candle as its background. So to position a candle kind of at an eye level so that the background of the flame will be dark. So then you can try and use a tall candle, or you can just lift the candle up on. So I would recommend a candle like this, or maybe even slightly bigger, but like standard white paraffin candles, because I don't actually have those wider tea light candles. But if you consider, for example, if you have that tea light candle, which has, okay, I can use this for reference. So you have like a candle that's shaped like this, and let's say that this wick, that this is here the wick. And then if you look at that candle from slightly above, then the flame, which is bright, will have a bright surface of the candle as its background. So the contrast between the flame and the candle would not be so striking. And that will make it harder to develop an nimitta. Because it's generally better when you have a flame which has some contrasting background. So a background that's so that when it stands like this, you have kind of nothing in the back. Preferably, you will dim the lights a bit so that the surroundings of the candle are a bit darker.
And to repeat, you'll want to have the flame slightly below the eye level, making sure that the candle itself is not creating the background for the flame, so that the flame has a contrasting background.
All right, another practical advice is to, at least before you develop some familiarity with the practice in general, is to work in a dimmed space. So you can also develop visuals in a bright environment. I've also worked with Fire Kasina in plain daylight, but initially it's just easier to find what you need to be looking for with dim lights. You can also, on your own, change a bit the brightness of the room. So you will also see that even with slight changes of the brightness in the room, the colors behind your eyes, or the shades of the colors behind your eyes, and the contrast might also change. That's also something that I would recommend to try on your own. If it's difficult to dim the room, then you can use something to cover your eyes. That also works equally well. Another thing is the distance of the candle. So generally, you don't want the candle to be too far, because then also the light on your retina will not be strong enough. And you don't want it to be too close, so maybe you can develop like an eye strain. Usually, for me, like an arm's length is a good distance. Like in the old books, they say like an arm's or an arm's and a half length, and slightly lower than straight. To set themselves up. So also a light bulb, if you have a light bulb around, is also fine. And so for those of you who are using the LED, I would also recommend to maybe put it down because if you close your eyes now, the LED will probably be very bright still. It will give a very bright reflection on your eyelids. So maybe you will need some time to get the nimitta. That's also practice for those with LEDs. So the idea is that you are, okay, let me just get mine on. So and I would also recommend to not stare directly into it, but maybe just tilt it slightly so to not put this extremely bright light in your eyes. And then just stare into it, and you will see that if you move the LED slightly, it also leaves this tracer, kind of. And now, for instance, when I'm looking at the screen, wherever is the center of my vision it's covered by this floater of light. And when I close my eyes, this floater, so this blob of color is right in front of my eyes. And it actually stays. So with the LED, you need much less time to get the dot, which is your object of meditation, than with a candle. So I would just do like this, stare for a bit before I get like a clear tracer when I move it slightly. And then I'm ready to close my eyes, basically. So if your background, when you close your eyes, is very bright, then it will take some time for you to identify which part of your visual field with eyes closed is the nimitta. But if your background is darker, so with a candle, you will need maybe even a minute to get the nimitta. So the instructions that I'm first giving is just for those using a flashlight. So the flashlight gives a nimitta in a matter of seconds. So maybe 10 seconds. And already, when I close my eyes, I see the blob. So can those with a flashlight try and confirm? All right, and those with a candle. So for those of you who have already experience with Fire Kasina, maybe you already know what to do. But generally, you want to have a focused but somewhat soft gaze on the candle because you can very quickly develop a bit of pain and kind of discomfort in the eyes, and you don't want that. You also want to try and get like a bit of kind of like a tiny squint or something because you want to blink as little as possible to maintain the eyes exposed to the candle longer. But if your eyes are fully open, then your eyes will very quickly get dry and you will have the urge to blink. But if you squint just gently, then you can stare into the candle for a longer time without blinking. And I experience also that it's a bit easier kind of to focus when you just like kind of slightly squint the eyes. And you try and look into the brightest part of the flame. And for those of you who are using a flashlight, if the dot, so the after image is there when you close your eyes, you can just try and observe it. So that this is your object of meditation. For those with a candle, so the moment to try and close your eyes to see if the nimitta is there is when you start seeing the greenish overlay on the bright part of the candle appearing. So you know how sometimes when you stare into a light bulb or into the sun, you get this bluish blob very quickly. So with the candle, it takes a bit longer for it to appear. But when it starts appearing, this will be the moment when you are likely to get a somewhat permanent nimitta. And the longer you stare into the candle, the longer your nimitta will stay. So I would recommend after the green blob appears, you can maybe look into the candle for another 20 seconds or so, and then we can try. And I can see that some of you already have their eyes closed. So when you close your eyes and when you see the after image of the flame or the LED, this is what you're focusing on. So initially, this this blob of color, this after image, might move a little to the side because the eyes have this habituated movement of constantly tracing everything in the environment. And now all of a sudden, they're looking for a reference point. And this dot is in the center of our visual field. So naturally, this dot, which is like an imprint on our retina, is now moving to the side. So this takes a bit of practice, but this is one of the milestones that you should strive for in your practice, that you should stabilize this dot. And a few things that help is to try and relax. So to not try to put in strong effort to stabilize it, but just to gently kind of return it to the center. And realize this is also a practice of concentration. So putting the nimitta in the middle is also a practice of concentration. Some of you might also have some conditions like strabism, so that their eyes are not centered on the same point. So you may actually have two nimittas, or you might have two slightly different shapes that sometimes overlap, sometimes don't overlap. There is nothing wrong with that, and it doesn't go against your practice in any way. It's just another thing to observe. So if that happens to you, then don't let yourself be discouraged by that. And another way to stabilize the nimitta and to generally kind of later to allow things to happen on the visual field is to realize that you're not seeing with your eyes. So that whatever you are seeing here, you're not literally seeing it with your eyes. And if the image fades, and if you lose all the colors, and if you lose all the brightness of the after image, when the environment of your visual field becomes kind of dull and boring, when there's not much going on, that's the time to refresh. So if that happens, you can simply open your eyes and use the source of light, whichever it is, to get the nimitta again. And then you do this over and over and over and over again and you focus on the nimitta, so on the after image. And there are a few distinctions here about what the nimitta is, what the dot is, what is the after image. So now I'm kind of conflating these terms. I will talk about them a bit more later because it will make more sense later. Okay, I would end this first part now. So take some time to find your own way of not straining your eyes. So for me, what I try describing, what works really well is this subtle squint. So when I'm just gently closing my eyelids, but it's like it's without straining the muscles too much either, but just like covering the eye a little bit. Because if you can look at me, I'm gonna try to kind of exaggerate with my face. So if you're focusing like this, then this will cause eye pain very quickly. Even within a 10-minute session, your eyes will hurt already. And if you look like this with eyes fully open, then your eyes will also get dry really quickly, and that will also not be comfortable. So what I do is kind of like a very gentle closing of the eyelids, but still kind of allowing my eyes to fully see. So I'm not closing my visual limits, but in my experience, when I close my eyes slightly, then the tears just constantly water the eye a little bit. So I almost never have to blink. But blinking occasionally is fine. But blinking all the time will make it harder to develop the after image. So that you see the candle, that's perfectly normal. Sometimes you will also see the inverse reflection of the whole room, of everything that you can develop a nimitta on a bookshelf. You can develop the after image of anything. So your eyes become very sensitive. And stabilizing it refers to the effect when you close your eyes, it starts to go into one corner. Usually for me, it always goes to the bottom left corner, and it always goes to the bottom left corner, and it always goes to so it goes to the edge, to the point where I feel like I can no longer see it, that I have to kind of track it, sometimes even with my whole body. So in this case, stabilizing it means that the after image is just somewhere around the comfortable center of your visual field, so that you can just sit and watch it without constantly searching for it in weird places. Yeah, if so, you should be able to assess yourself when when staying with the object results in counterproductive dullness. So as long as you feel that you are in contact with the object, and that it is a process of concentration, that's fine. So, and in the moment where the contact doesn't give enough material to interact with, to the point that your practice becomes dull in that moment, then it's better to refresh and to find a new object so that you can stay engaged. Eventually, the background of the nimitta, which is the second screen, will give enough material to stay engaged with the practice. But here, engagement is very important until you reach the murk. Then the murk is a whole different territory, and it requires a different approach. But we'll talk about that later. But generally, so refreshing is a way to keep engaged with the practice. Yeah. All right. Then, let's make this the last question, and then I have another drill, and then will go for the full guided practice. Yeah, so there are different ways to explain this, and what works practically and conceptually really well for me is to consider that this is also like a mystical explanation, that because you're so much involved with the element of fire, or just producing heat in an abstract way, and some people experience heat in their body when they do fire Kasina, I would recommend to balance out the elements by holding a bowl of water, or by taking a shower before you start doing the practice, or having a pot with soil next to you and just touching soil. This sounds bizarre, but it works. Or maybe just like having a stone or something like that. Another thing that you can do is, so the five elements are water, fire, air, space. No, wait. Ether. So space is ether, and which other element? Earth. Earth, yeah. So you can kind of balance out any of the elements with the other elements. So, for instance, if you feel too much, some of them combine in a bit more aggressive way. So if you combine air and fire, then you might actually get more heat. But space is a good one. So this is also something that links to the open awareness meditation. So you can also try to expand your perceived awareness. All right. So before we go for the guided practice, I'm taking a bit more time here tonight. So I would invite you to close your eyes, and I would like to first confirm that you can all identify what I would use then to guide color control. So without looking into the candle, just close your eyes, and you can see the whatever the color of the background is, no matter how dark it is. You can find these tiny, tiny, tiny specks of colors, like TV snow. So if you can see that, then please just nod. If your screen is not fully monochrome black, but if you can find any sparkles that gives this kind of grainy background. All right. Okay. Yeah, so that's it. If it's not monotone, then this is what we're going to focus on. So we will use the candle flame, we will refresh, but we will try to stay a bit longer at the end and focus on this not monochromatic aspect of the visual field. So note that the color of the after image itself is a bit difficult to control, and this is not our goal. So we will try to control what stays when the after image disappears. And I will try to do that before 9. And then we can, if you still have time, we can stay and discuss, or you can write me a message. Mm-hmm. So when you close your eyes without the after image, the visual field shouldn't be like a screen of perfectly uniform color. It should have some granular, tiny specks of like contrasts, or maybe like sparkles of different colors, or however you want to describe it, but it's not perfectly uniform. All right. Now, finally, let us begin. So you can take your candle or LED, whatever is the starter for the after image. And gently stare into it and try to be focused. And this is also an opportunity to monitor your mind. So while you're looking at the candle, you want to develop this non-wavering type of attention. So in the same way as when, for example, you're monitoring the breath, you can monitor your attentiveness to the candle. If you notice that your mind wanders, then you just gently put it back on the candle. If it helps you, you can have some meta comments, mental meta comments of, oh, look, now it looks like that. Or, oh, look, it has this shape. Or, oh, look, now there's this contrast. Or the flame looks a bit transparent. So some mental comments like that, only about what you see in the candle, are acceptable. But generally try to clear your mental space from any other processes. You may also notice that your eyes will go in and out of focus, or that the candle will go in and out of focus. So that actually doesn't play such a big role, how you are focused or where is your focal point. The candle can be blurry or it can be perfectly clear, or it can shift. So if you already have an after image, then you just focus on it, try and keep it stably in front of you, so it doesn't have to be perfectly in the center, but so that you don't have to chase it around. And observe it. Try to be really intrigued by how it manifests and how it moves and how the edges maybe change. So just like how you were engaged and immersed in seeing how the candle flame is, you are now intrigued by the after image. And again, you're keeping the contents of your mind as clean as possible. So you're also monitoring that you're not paying attention to anything else, that you are not engaged with other mental objects or physical objects. And you keep bringing your attention back to the after image. And it's very important to develop this very interested, very engaged perspective on it. So to constantly investigate what it is doing, how it is moving. You can note the color that it has in the middle, Perhaps there is a slightly different color around the edges. Maybe there are actually several colors forming up the after image. If it flickers, try and see how fast it flickers. And try also to pay attention to the surroundings of the after image or to the background. But still keep the after image as your central focus. And I cannot have an idea for when your nimitta fades, so you will have to time this on your own, but when the nimitta fades, stay in the space for a while longer and try and investigate in the same space, in the same way, try and investigate the visual field. So presuming that's a dark visual field, and perhaps it shows with some specks of colors or some flickers of colors or some kind of grainy background. So just try and detect how it manifests and whether you can detect whether that has an overtone or whether there are multiple colors. So generally try and inspect that somewhat dark visual field. Note that gray is also a color, and so is black. Perhaps there are some yellow or golden colors, or maybe some bluish overtones. And when you find that you've had enough of that, then you can refresh. And once you refresh, then you repeat the whole process again. And make sure to keep a very engaged attitude with anything that you are inspecting or observing on the visual field. So try and notice how the after image is now. It might be slightly different than the previous time. If you will be playing this recording maybe later, then you can also pause and play this when you refresh. The after image could stay the same or similar between refreshes, but it could also change. Again, you're focusing only on the after image. Try and not apply too much of an effort. Just a gentle focus with a lot of presence could be enough. You may notice also that when you keep your gaze straight and stable, the mental chatter also ceases. This is because keeping a straight gaze also disables parts of your brain that produce mental chatter. So you can just try and keep your eyes straight and stable. And perhaps that helps. But don't focus too much on the eyes, focus on the image. And again, if you have reached the end of a cycle, so if your nimitta or after image has disappeared, let's do the same thing again. So, or even if you have the after image still in your visual field, you can try and pay more attention to the surrounding area. And again, focus on the granularity, focus on the grainy, non-uniform aspect of it, and try and detect any colors that you might find there. So this time we'll spend a bit more time in there and go one step longer. But first, just try and dedicate as much attention as you can to inspecting very closely. And you can also kind of try and be amused by it or anything that helps you be engaged. And try and detect what colors you can find there. Sometimes purples are very easy on a dark background. So maybe you actually can find it easy to see purple specks on this background. Or if your light is in front of you, then maybe you have a golden or yellow or orange light shining through your closed eyelids. This is your object of meditation. This is your source of focus. So just note any color aspect of the dark visual field. And any kind of flickering, any sparkling, anything of that sort, then you can notice. You should try and focus on that. Even if it shows up as gray or not something that you would classify as one of the bright or rainbow colors, any contrast that you can find here. So now try and find the color that's somehow most dominant for you here. Even if it's gray, then you focus on that. So just not black. Any other color that's dominant in the field, and try and focus on it. Try and somehow to get close to it with your vision. Try to see it, as much of it as possible. So the goal is to see as much of this color as possible. So you find all the specks and all the parts of the grains that show up with that color. And you may notice that when you do this, then your visual field starts actually to have more of that color. And perhaps this requires a bit more practice, but generally this is what will start happening. So if you see yellow specks, for example, or purple specks, then you just try and seek those out. You try and find only the yellow ones or only the gray ones. And then the coverage will increase. And that might be subtle, but it will start happening. So you shouldn't expect to have a beam of pink light covering your whole visual field, but generally the amount of that color should increase, even slightly. Maybe you still have black background or black surroundings, but now you have a bit more color. And still as before, you're very amused and very intrigued in the visual field. And now you can try and notice another color. Perhaps it will be necessary to not notice any specific color for a bit. So just to kind of phase out for a moment. And then when you come back, again, you become intrigued and immersed in analyzing the fine details and the fine contrasts of the visual field. And try and choose another color. And do the same thing. So seek out, find all the spots where that color is showing up. It can be a bit like a computer screen where every pixel has several colors, but you focus only on the one that you have chosen. And as before, that color should start to cover the visual field slightly more than before. So you should refresh this attempt to see this color, so to try and find this shade in the visual field in a similar way as you are attending to the breath. So you're constantly kind of making, for example, if it's blue, you're constantly making mental contact with blue, 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 blue. So wherever you see it in the visual field, you just confirm it. Blue, 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 blue. And for the end, let's try an advanced move. So try and think another color and try and just make the visual field change into that color. So just try and think if it was blue before, try and think green and try and find it a bit faster. Try and see if you can change the perspective or the choice of color faster. And again, you should repeat, for example, green, 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 mentally. And this should not be the kind of effort that would make you frown or something like that, that would create tension, but just like choosing or finding ways to see green or thinking green. So just finding very quickly specks of colors that can over dominate, that can create a green overtone. And this will become easier the more cycles of refreshment you do. Your background will become more vivid. That's what typically should happen from this practice, that your background will become more vivid, and then colors will become more accessible. But the technique for the change of the screen, for the change of the color of the screen, is the same. Then you become better at it and you can start to manipulate it more easily. So I would bring it to a close here. You can end the practice now, and now we have some time for discussion. By doing this practice, your visual space will also become more malleable. So your mind becomes less convinced by a firm grasp on what is reality and what is possible and what is not possible to do in the visual field. And manipulating the visual field becomes more accessible the more you do the practice. The practice also comes with side effects, which are not to be neglected. So it's a very powerful practice. It can kind of hijack the patterns in which your brain typically works because you are using its mechanism of prediction, that it's kind of, you're feeding a different stimulus and you are kind of training it to skip it, or to, yeah, you're trying to fool your brain in a way. I'm using very simple language, but I'm struggling to find better words right now. And so side effects are that, for example, you can have very vivid dreams. So those could potentially also be nightmares. There's no way to predict whether there will be nice dreams or not nice dreams, but if you do this practice daily, it's very likely that you will start dreaming more and that you will have very vivid dreams. Other things are that you can start developing visuals even when you're not using the candle. So for me, it happened a few times when I was practicing more regularly that I had even psychedelic visuals anytime I would close my eyes. So not only that I had more colors, but I also had very structured shapes. And I remember that the first time that happened, I wasn't really comfortable with that, so then I stopped practicing. And you can also have visions, something that a mental doctor or that a psychiatrist might even classify as some form of psychosis or something like that. So you can start to have your thoughts will start to gain mental impressions more than they normally do. So if you think something, you can start having a visual image in your mind's eye, a very vivid visual image of that. And sometimes those can also, because this is not what we are maybe necessarily used to. So for example, those can also appear in a somewhat of a dreamy way. So for example, you can have an impression that somebody is watching you just when you're thinking about a situation with other people or something like that. So that's something to be aware of and to be prepared for when you engage in this practice. It won't necessarily happen with everybody, but I would say that some aspects of this enhanced perception or distorted perception will happen to anybody who practices Fire Kasina regularly. And there are very common effects like seeing with your eyes closed and stuff like that that happens to anybody who practices Fire Kasina regularly, that you start to see the whole visual field in real colors or in like kind of like a reduced photorealistic way, or to see around the edges of your visual field. So you close your eyes and you can see the periphery, for example, of your visual field with eyes closed, and it's reliable. It actually somehow shows up in the same way as it would with your eyes open. So yeah, some things to keep in mind. You can place the nimitta, you can, for example, find a uniform surface, like a wall or a fridge or something that doesn't have a lot of things going on. That's the easiest surface. You can place the nimitta on the surface and then just look into that and do the same thing as what you do with eyes closed. But practicing eyes open is also a way to do Fire Kasina, and you would actually develop a nimitta, and then you would do that. So you would place it somewhere, and then, for example, you could walk towards it, and then place it on something else, and then walk towards that, or yeah, just sit and practice eyes open. Then sometimes the nimitta will start forming contrast and start to merge with whatever it is the surface. So once I was looking at a tree bark, which had like a very striking texture, and then the nimitta started to kind of seep into the bark, and it started to like feed color and like leak color into the creases. So yeah, we'll start doing something like that. Yeah, this is quite normal if you're doing it for the first time, and it will probably, oh yeah. Yeah, sorry. This is quite normal if you're doing it for the first time. And even if so for me, it's very effortless to do Fire Casino, but if I start doing it on a retreat, I will usually have a bit of a headache in the first few hours. And then everything relaxes and there is no more headache. But generally, if you repeat the practice for a few days, you will find your own way to relax your head and your eyes and everything. And you can try to do that willingly. So you can try to practice kind of to squeeze the eyes and then to relax them, to see where, in which part you can find that relaxation, and then to relax it. And generally, a softer gaze, even with your eyes closed, you can try and just kind of, so the move is something like when you're trying to take a nap. So you're still awake, you're still looking, but you're kind of doing this move of, oh, I'm just resting and relaxing. Maybe that helps. Yeah, you can do that. I also know some people who practice in the dark with their eyes open. Yeah, I think that's a very good point. I would just say that sometimes when you try to dilute the pupils, that can also cause a strain. So it's as if you're like pushing the eyes too much. So yeah, I think you need to find for yourself what is a comfortable position for the eyes. And I would argue that it's probably similar for everybody, but it's a bit difficult to instruct this kind of, at least for me. Maybe some other people here have a better way to give advice for how to relax the eyes. But definitely it has something to do with the dilation of the pupils and the focus that you adjust like that. So if the background gives enough material and if the nimitta is not there, then that means that you are in a stage where the nimitta just tends to disappear. So there will always be a stage where the nimitta will tend to appear less, or it will go kind of, it's sometimes as if it's disappearing behind this background. So sometimes it emerges through the dark and then it disappears and sometimes it can, even when you're not anymore focused on the nimitta, when you're anyway only focusing on the dark, the nimitta can just appear. And it's happening a bit sometimes out of the blue. But so if you're doing practices such as color control, you don't necessarily need the nimitta. But it will be nimitta, or the after image is useful because it will, by repeating it, by cycling through it, you will build a more vivid um, background. So it will make your visual field overall more vivid. Everything is something to observe. This is also, in that sense, it's an insight practice. So everything that you see in the visual field is something to be intrigued by. So then you can start to observe how, for example, when these floaters, when they approach the nimitta, whether there's like an effect that happens when they merge, or how they penetrate through the screen, or whether they wiggle or whether they don't wiggle, whether they have a color. And then chances are that these floaters will also get more details, perhaps. So this is not something that I wanted to include in the guidance because I thought it would be too much, but the breath is another thing that you can use to hold your focus on the nimitta. Because most of us are also habituated to focus on the breath, so you can kind of allow your attention to synchronize with the phase of the breath and just observe the nimitta. So you kind of have this double object, so the breath is a bit in the background, but it's habituated and it's keeping your attention stable. And then with active attention, you are exploring the visual space. So the breath is not something that you necessarily need to ignore. Another auxiliary object is a mantra. So another auxiliary object is the mantra. So you can, for example, choose a simple mantra that you constantly repeat while you're looking at the nimitta. It can also just be Om. So you just like do at every inhalation or exhalation, you just do Om, 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 or you can do any other, you can choose any mantra, or you can just use a verse of a song that has a special meaning to you or something like that. And that will also prevent your mind chatter from going on a random tangent. So that way you're keeping your verbal senses and your visual attention covered. And then you can try to keep those two. And sometimes the mantra will disappear as well, or it will be harder. At times it will come back on its own. It will become louder, quieter. The mantra can also change in the same way as the after image changes. But yeah, that's another kind of assistive object that you can use together with a visual field. Any of it is what you're going for. So any kind of change in the visual field and spider webs are quite common. So spider webs might eventually turn into vortices or some kind of like tunnels where you can like have a feeling that you're going through a tunnel or something like that. Typically, for some people even on retreat, it takes them a few days to get a color to appear consistently. So just the fact that you're able to get at least a slight effect is already really good. And what's important is that you know where to look for colors. And then later, for example, what you can also do is when you detect a shape, and a shape can be just a line, or it can be a dot, or it can be a spider web, or it can be a worm, it can be anything. There are no good or bad shapes. You can also try in the same way that you are seeing colors, or kind of seeing colors to appear, or wishing colors to appear. You can also imagine shapes, and shapes are a bit more difficult, but then you can change colors of those shapes. So if you see any shape, in the same way, you can try and find a dominant color in the shape. And then you can see that that shape will become slightly more blue, for example. And those are the little steps that you start do bit by bit, and then they accumulate and they make a huge difference, and then you can slowly develop a much better control over the visual field. It should generally improve your concentration overall, and it should make insight more accessible. So fine perception of the sensory experience, it should make it more easy and more accessible. It should also make meta more intense, or generally it makes any other practice that you're doing more accessible or more intense. That's also something to keep in mind. So that doesn't necessarily need to be a good thing. But so a good thing is that also when you stop practicing Fire Casino, the effects fade away in 2 or 3 days. So yeah, there's no lasting change that you can create or something like that. Yeah, generally Fire Casino does jhanas really well, and it does insight really well. So I don't know, it's just a really amazing practice because it's so versatile, I find. I'm not sure about people who have who are on the spectrum of aphantasia. So I don't have any information about that, but Fire Casino will generally increase the detail of your visual thinking also. So at some points during also kind of visual short-term memory. So at some point I would be able to generate mental images. So that would not necessarily form on my visual screen, but I would have a visual impression, and I could create complex objects and like manipulate them and move them and add stuff to them and stuff like that, and they would remain permanently present in my visual field, in the mind, yeah, in the mind. So there are kind of generally, I would say, three visual fields. One is eyes open, the other one is on the back of your eyelids, and the other one is in your mind's eye. So the one in your mind's eye, if you want to do any kind of imagination type practice, so constructive practices, there the visions will be most easily accessible and most complex. And then the next one is the back of your eyelids, which is a bit more difficult, but you can also develop very intricate visuals there. And then the most difficult is eyes open. But you can also start doing color control and shape control and all of that eyes open. Maybe next time or so we can talk a bit more about the Fire Casino terminology. But generally, there's this concept of screens, where the after image is the first screen, the background of the image is the second screen. And then with more practice, you may come to a third screen, which will be an overlay on the second screen. And I have never seen a fourth screen, but it should also be an overlay, but I have no idea where it manifests or how it manifests. But they are all increasingly more detailed and realistic. So second screen imagery can be 3D, it can have depth, it can move, it can show like natural kind of spanning, and it can look like reality in all aspects except that it doesn't have photorealistic colors. So it's always a bit grainy and it always shows up in contrasts. So it can have multiple colors at the same time, but they are never as photorealistic as the colors that you see with your eyes open. And then the third screen becomes fully photorealistic. And the fourth screen should be that with eyes open, but I'm not really sure how that works. And like sometimes even now, because another thing about Fire Kasina is that some of the skills of seeking out those things you can develop. So for instance, now I can do shape control and color control with basic shapes and colors anytime, without any practice, without having a nimitta, without having anything. And in the same way, I can try. Hmm? Yeah, also with eyes open a little bit, yeah. And it sounded jealous, I think. But it's something that you can also practice. And also, like with this hypnagogic period, you can also learn how to find shapes there. But the more you practice, the easier it gets spontaneously. I would say if you want to start getting effects, typically it's recommended to do around 40%, 40%, 45 minutes daily. Yeah, that depends on your personal disposition, but I would say 40 minutes a day will give you some results that you can notice within a week or so. Yeah, so eventually the background will become more and more vivid. So then you will refresh less and you will focus more on the background. And if there is nothing in the background, then just refresh again. So if you go into dullness, then just refresh. But sometimes you can go through the whole session with just one ignition. And when you get to the murk, so the murk is a period, for example, when the nimitta tends to disappear, when it appears as a ring with a black hole inside consistently, when it sometimes doesn't even appear, so you stare into the candle and then you close your eyes and there's nothing. And you know that every time before there was something, but now there's nothing. And the background also becomes dull. And sometimes everything you see is gray. And you feel like you're practicing and you're concentrating, but it feels like you're not even practicing. It feels like you're sitting and not doing anything. It's totally counterintuitive and counterproductive, and it doesn't give any confidence about the practice. But that's the murk. And you just need to continue practicing and it will be over. And I don't know how yeah, it's the dark night of Fire Casino. And the less you buy into it, the less it will mean anything. So it's just a phase in perception, and yeah, we still don't know why it shows up the way it does, but it often shows up consistently. And in Fire Casino, it tends to be a bit more persistent than with other insight practices, where it can just be a short phase and fade and end quickly. In Fire Casino, it can stay around on retreat for like 3-4 days before you're out of the murk. And what you need to do is just keep on practicing as if nothing is happening. And the tricky thing is that, well, I've actually never had the murk at home. So I never reached the murk at home. I'm not sure if the murk even shows up. I've never asked anybody if the murk shows up in daily practice. But if it would, it could also be followed with slightly negative emotions or like a negative mental attitude. And if that happens, then I think the best thing to do is to just reach out to a sangha. And if you're practicing Fire Casino, then you should know that that's the murk. And then you can write to me or write in the group and we can try and work it out. But generally, in absence of other advice, just keep practicing. And you will not want to practice, and you will receive all the signs from your intuition, from your will, and from everything to not practice. But just keep practicing. I think there's something about the brain preparing for sleep in the evening that might produce more visuals on the black surface. On the other hand, you might be more energized in the morning, so that might also be good for practice. So yeah, I would recommend trying different approaches. Yeah, I mean, you can try and find some pleasant aspects with, for example, if you have golden or yellowish color in the visual screen, for example, if you have a bit more light coming through the eyelids, then you can just kind of like immerse yourself into that screen of golden light and find that it's pleasant. And what you can also do is that you can do metta on it. So you can do metta on the flame, you can do metta on that visual field. So yeah, you can find emotional overtones in the practice. All right, I think I'm gonna close it here. This has been delightful.